back, or hello, if this is your first time joining. We're just going to run through some housekeeping. We won't start right on the dot. Just so you know, for this session, we do have a Q&A function. If you would like to ask a question, there will be a Q&A period at the end. There is closed captioning with live French translation if you would like to hear the session in French. We also want to let you know that in the unlikely event we experience any sort of unplanned disruption during this session, we may have to conclude the session immediately. And if that happens, we'll just give everybody a follow-up so you know what will happen next. And as well, you will have heard this session is being recorded. I'm just going to pause for a moment to let everybody continue to join, and then we'll get started in a couple more minutes. And as well, for folks who are already in and joining, please do introduce yourselves. Let us know who you are, where you're from, what you're currently curious about. All right, everyone, we're 2 minutes past. Let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to the pre-conference webinar series for eCampus Ontario's annual Technology Education Seminar Showcase. We would like to start this session with a land acknowledgement. The offices of eCampus Ontario are located in downtown Toronto, which are within the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And is currently home to many First Nations. We would like to acknowledge and thank these diverse Indigenous peoples whose footsteps have, currently do, and will continue to mark this territory. We also ask you to consider the caretakers of your lands and waters that you're situated on. I'm coming here to you today as a settler on these same lands covered by Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaties, where I have the honor to work and play. And we encourage you to share your own land acknowledgements in the chat as we all convene in this digital space. So today, you're joining us right now for the session titled Rediscovering Open Education for a Resilient Future. And our keynote speaker is Anne-Marie Scott, who is the Vice President of the Commonwealth of Learning, which is located in Vancouver, Canada. She works with the Commonwealth of Learning to support the mission and work of learning for sustainable development. She is an internationally recognized expert in digital, online, and open education with leadership experience across higher education and nonprofit sectors. The Commonwealth of Learning is hosted by the Government of Canada with headquarters in Vancouver, British Columbia, and is the world's only intergovernmental organization solely concerned with the promotion and development of distance education and open learning. The Commonwealth of Learning's greatest impact is in supporting efforts to provide Commonwealth citizens access to greater education through open, distance, and technology-enabled learning, allowing them to benefit from improved livelihoods, greater gender equity, and overall economic, social, and cultural development, overall leading to sustainable development. So please join me in welcoming Anne-Marie Scott.
Hello, thank you very much. And thank you, Mary, for the kind introduction. And welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us. Let me just see if I can get my slides up on screen. Let me just do the sharing thing. Okay. Now I can't see the chat because I only have one screen where I am today. So my apologies if I'm not keeping an eye on it, but I know our lovely hosts from eCampus Ontario will be keeping an eye on it. So I want to spend a little bit of time today talking about some of the work I do. And I see a few names in the attendees list that have known me for a while. And so those people will know I've been at Commonwealth of Learning for precisely 5.5 months now. So not that long. Prior to that, I was at Athabasca University here in Canada. Spent some time working as a an independent consultant. And before that, I spent 20 years at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And some of you will notice this is not a Canadian accent, but I now live and work in Vancouver, and I'm very pleased to be there. Okay, so I will start with recognition of where I live, and I'm incredibly grateful, I think, in this increasingly complex world to have a safe place to call home. I'm lucky to live in Vancouver on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. And when I do my land acknowledgements, I like to try and find murals or graffiti from Indigenous artists. And in Vancouver, that's not a hard thing to do, because I think it's important to emphasize that First Nations are a living and breathing part of the culture in which we live, and they certainly are visible in Vancouver in a way that I appreciate and brings joy. Bluntly, this is a mural I'm very familiar with because it happens to be very close to a bar I like to visit quite regularly. So I'm very fond of this particular mural for a number of reasons. Mary introduced a little bit about Commonwealth of Learning, but I'll tell you a little bit more. I suspect some of you will know about Commonwealth of Learning. Again, I know a few people on the attendees list will, but many of you may not. We have tended, I think, to fly under the radar a little bit, particularly in Canada, which is weird because we are hosted in Canada. We are an intergovernmental organisation, which means we're owned by the 56 countries of the Commonwealth. We're a very small organisation. There's about 40 of us based in Vancouver and another 5 in our centre in New Delhi. And we have diplomatic status here in Vancouver. We're hosted by the government of government of Canada, I beg my pardon. And we have UN status for our centre in New Delhi. And as Mary said in the introduction, we are the only intergovernmental in the world that is focused on open online education, but particularly in that development context and across the 56 countries of the Commonwealth. And we like to think of ourselves as having a very distinctive toolkit. Open, and I've bolded that word on these slides, open is at the heart of what we do, but we work collaboratively. We're here to bring Commonwealth countries together to share best practice. We're here to bring countries, institutions within countries, organizations within countries, or indeed countries together in regions, across regions, to co-create and to share. And we focus on both policy work and practical on the ground kind of project work. And I'll give you some examples of the kinds of things we do. As I said already, we're hosted by the Government of Canada. If you're not sure which countries are in the Commonwealth, this will give you a snapshot view. It's important to note that, as well as some big countries, Canada in physical size, but maybe Australia, the UK, New Zealand, Singapore, Brunei, countries with quite strong economies. We also have the largest number of small states in the world inside the Commonwealth, and we have some very much less well-developed countries of the world inside the Commonwealth. So it's a very, very diverse and broad group of stakeholders with a very, very diverse and broad set of needs. COL is governed by a board of governors made up of various important representatives, but we report to the ministers and the heads of government of the Commonwealth. So that's the bit that goes with the intergovernmental in the name. So we work to the needs and the demands of Commonwealth countries. We have specialist expertise that we can bring to play, but really our agenda is whatever the agenda is of the various countries within the Commonwealth. And we work very closely with other Commonwealth organisations, the biggest one being the Commonwealth Secretariat, which is based in London. There are 3 Commonwealth intergovernmentals. We are the only one based outside of London. We're hosted in Canada. And we're here because in 1987, there was a Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Vancouver. where the possibility of setting up something like CALL was floated. And everybody said, yes, that sounds like an excellent idea, but please don't put another one in London. And so the government of Canada said, why not have it here? So if anybody's wondering why Vancouver, it was 1987, there was a meeting there. 1988, we were set up in Vancouver. We, as well as our centre in New Delhi, we have a few smaller centres. These are not call staff. These are centres of expertise or excellence that we have strong working relations with. So Retrodol in West Africa, 3CL based in Malta, SADC CDE based in Southern Africa, and Packfold based at the University of the South Pacific in the Pacific region. And we tend to think of the Commonwealth as being broken up into broadly regions, though I would say Africa probably is several regions, southern, eastern, western, very different. And again, when you look at something like the Pacific region, there are very different kinds of countries in these regions as well. But we tend to think of the Commonwealth in these big sort of regional buckets as well as at the individual country level. And we work with focal points in each of these countries. So these are usually people based in government ministries that are our everyday link with the needs of those countries. And we tend also to have strong relationships with mostly the education ministries in countries. But again, it can be with the Foreign Office in some. It really can vary country to country. The kinds of work that we do. Again, open is at the heart of everything, but we work at several different levels. So we'll do work at a national level. We'll work with a government, perhaps a national regulator. And it's important to work at that sort of level because that's where you can have greatest impact over the long term. If you can get a national policy in place, for example, that can be really powerful and impactful over the long term. So when we're working with governments, we're really looking to support them to kind of unlock learning as a superpower to enable whatever it is they need in their country. We do also work directly with institutions. We work with universities, colleges, schools. We work across many different parts of the education sector. Probably the only area that we don't is in early childhood and basic education, so the lower part of the K-12 system. And then where we are where we need to or where there's a good reason to, we will step beyond institutions into community education as well. So in some regions some countries that we work in and some of the areas in those countries, it makes more sense to partner with an NGO and do direct delivery of education, upskilling, capacity building with individual communities. So working to empower learners directly. And in all of this, we are looking to really enable greater equity. So if open is our toolkit, the goal of all of this is inclusion. It's bringing people into education, bringing them into society and enabling them to have stronger and better lives and livelihoods, whatever that means for them. And we try to do this in spaces where other people don't work. So, there are a lot of other multilaterals in the world. And I think it's important, especially when in a world of dwindling resources, that we work to our best strengths. And I think our strength really is in being quite agile, being responsive, and that strong link that we have with governments and with their priorities and within that Commonwealth family, where we can, bring people together and connect people together. And post-pandemic, some of what we were doing in the past has become easier. I think the case for more online, for example, has been made. But yes, as it says at the bottom of this slide, our kind of unique selling point is that we can bring expertise across a wide range of countries, and we can do it in a more agile way than other people can. Okay, so a couple of examples of what we do. We will work with countries over quite a long period of time. There'll be many individual projects which can build up into a bigger overall change. So in SVET, we supported over, let's do some quick maths, about 5 and a bit years, supported their open school to flip from a paper-based model for distance education to an online and OER-based model. When I say open school, I'm talking about the upper end of the K to 12 education sector here. So we started off by doing a kind of scoping study. We then built out some support to develop OERs. And in tandem with that, we started building capacity, teacher capacity around online and distance learning. Then we started looking at some of the technology needs and eventually got them to the point where we could start introducing policy. We'd done enough capacity building that we could really start to make the change and introduce an OER-based online distance learning model instead of this high-cost print-based distance education model. And by 2024, looking at the effectiveness of that model versus some of the other schooling systems in the country. In fact, that blended model was more effective. Students were doing better ultimately. So we will work with people over the long term on these kind of transformational projects, piece by piece, building up the capabilities and the capacity that they need, supporting them through developing some of the instruments they need to roll the change out. That's one example in Africa. We did similar kind of work, but in the higher education space in Malaysia. So again, looking at supporting, in that case, the development of a national OER policy, and then supporting one individual institution to build its capacity in technology-enabled learning, and then scaling that up to a number of other universities, adopting that or implementing that OER policy through a number of universities. And by the time we get to 2024, the University of Malaysia Sabah is now 95% blended learning and is in a position where they are now starting to support other universities to follow the same pathway as they have, particularly around OER textbooks and building technology competencies. So again, long-term change through a number of targeted initiatives that build on each other over time, and capacity building. I will use that phrase a few times. Capacity building, one institution developing a strength, or one area of an education system developing a strength, and then being able to support the scaling up of that within the country or sometimes within a region. We also do, as well as these sort of long-term pieces of work, initiatives which build out of multiple projects, we will take on large, long-running pieces of work. So this was a 3-year piece of work that we did in the Pacific region, sponsored in this case by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade in New Zealand, really looking to support a range of the small Pacific island states there were 3 strands in this work. One was around building out STEM education particularly. Another was around distance education, online learning skills, and teacher competencies. So some community-based skills education, some teacher training, and then some technology enablement as well, looking to lift the capabilities of a whole region and strengthen the education systems of a whole region. And so these are broad streams, but within each of these, there are many small pieces of work that are specific to the individual island states in the Pacific and specific to their needs. And this, as I say, was a 3-year project. It's just concluding, and we're actually starting to plan the next phase of work again with the government of New Zealand. So I've given you, one other one. I'm sorry, I'll just touch on Teacher in the Loop AI. We are also, as well as some of the tried and tested work around things like OER policies and technology enablement, we do have an innovation strand. So we have also been doing a small project, which we call Teacher in the Loop AI, which is helping groups of teachers in different parts of the Commonwealth to use an AI-enabled OER generation platform, and really to understand where generative AI fits in the OER landscape, and look at how we skill up and develop communities of practice and ethical practices around OER generation. And in this one, we are working with an Indian Institute of Technology as the technology provider. And then we are deploying the technology and the training in other regions as well as India. So in this case, Jamaica, Kenya, and Nigeria. And in some of that work is in the vocational education sector, some of that work is in the teacher training K to 12 part of the education system. So again, not limited to one part of the education sector either. So why open education? Why do we do these things, and why do we do these things using open education? It's our fundamental belief that if the Sustainable Development Goal 4 describes the problem, the number of people who are not in education, the number of people who are restricted from access to educational opportunity, and the way in which education underpins and enables many of the other Sustainable Development Goals, it's our belief that open is the answer to how we solve SDG 4.
Comment solutionner
And I've put some notes
ce
at the bottom
problème?
here in
J'ai mis
terms of
quelques
who we
notes ici au
are
bas
in
de
online and
l'écran de
distance
qui nous
learning. I'm
sommes
feeling it probably
et les
doesn't preach to this particular group of people, but essentially we are at a point where even if there was enough money, there is not enough time to build out using conventional education systems, brick and mortar schools, brick and mortar institutions. There is not enough time to build out what is needed. It cannot keep pace with demand. It hasn't in the past, it won't in our future. And so change and embracing particularly OER and online and distance learning, it's our belief that that is the only way of meeting some of the big challenges that are in front of us. And some of you may notice these are some training courses that we developed for the Pacific region, but in conjunction with Canadian University in Ontario. Some of you will have noticed the Lakehead logo on these courses. So we do draw on expertise from all across the Commonwealth, even if we're not working in a Commonwealth country. We don't do an awful lot of work in Canada for Canada. Canada's own needs can be met by Canada's own resources. But we do draw on some of the deep expertise that exists across the Commonwealth, and Canada's not excluded from that. We will, as well as believing that open is the only way to get there, we believe open is a Commonwealth value. So some of the original and largest open universities are in the Commonwealth. Some of the world's largest open school is in the Commonwealth. NIOS in India is the largest open schooling system in the world. So, and we know through work in Eswatini and elsewhere that open learning is not a deficit model. It can beat the status quo, it can be at least as good, and sometimes it can beat conventional education systems. So it's a particularly Commonwealth value, and it is the answer to some of the big challenges that exist within the Commonwealth. So I'm going to pause there and say, well, that's lovely. I work in a very cool place. Commonwealth of Learning is the coolest place in Canada that you didn't know about. But I'm going to flip a little bit and say, as somebody who's worked in the Canadian sector and in the UK sector before, and in open education across a long period of time, when I look at the particular moment we're in now in Canada, but also honestly in the UK and Australia, some of the same challenges are playing out in multiple jurisdictions. I look at the depth of expertise and the work that's going on in somewhere like Commonwealth of Learning and think those answers can be our answers too. And when I look at what open education is as a toolkit, and I've talked about distance learning and OER in the call context, but this open education is a huge and diverse toolkit. And this is, again, an image I'm sure a number of you've seen before. It's an OE global image that my colleague at BC Campus, Clint Lalonde, tweaked up a few years ago to really tease out some values that exist inside this open education toolkit. So we've got OER there, we've got open source, repositories, open data, MOOCs, open content, a whole bunch of things there. But there's some fundamental values that wrap around all of that, around access, flexibility, equity, collaboration. Collaboration is super important. Agency, individuals having agency, some beliefs around social justice, the transformative power of education, transparency, being open, being open in a being open to scrutiny as well as being open to sharing, and fundamentally removing barriers. These are values that I think you can trace across a lot of these open education domains of practice, and domains of policy. And I'm highlighting that because as I think about how we might use open education and how some of the answers to the problems we're facing might already be known to us, I want us to think about open education as this very expansive toolkit. So, Canada, the moment we're in. I'm sure, and again, a number of you get the morning email from Alex Ucha and Isa, and they do this lovely report every year about the state of post-secondary education in Canada. And the 2025 report was slightly depressing reading. The money has fallen out of the Canadian education system, particularly the post-secondary system, and we know why this is. And as somebody who watched this happen 15 years ago in the UK, I'm questioning some life choices about where I've moved to. But I can also see a little bit of the trajectory that we're on and some of the moves that are going to be the next moves that we make. But I think it's also worth remembering that this world right now feels more complex and more turbulent than it has in a long time. But actually, for many people, the world has always been like this. We've been quite lucky, particularly in Western Northern Hemisphere countries, to live in a period of stability, economic stability, political stability. It feels very unsettling to us in this moment, but it has been the reality for a large number of people in the world for a long time. And so again, a bunch of the work that we do in CALL are in some of those places that have not enjoyed the same kind of stability as we have. And the approaches that we have taken have been useful approaches for dealing with some of those sustainability and resilience challenges that those regions have faced. So for as much as a report like this is kind of grim reading, and the funding model has changed, and it is painful, and I understand that it impacts lives and livelihoods. But relatively speaking, we are still more stable than some places, and there's still more money to go around than in some places. So all is not lost. Answers are available to us, and we can act. We haven't lost our agency, even though it maybe feels like a slightly paralyzing moment. But I think we also have to be a bit realistic about where we are. Again, I'm sure a number of you read this report quite regularly as well. Every year we have the Pan-Canadian Digital Learning Association's report. And this I recognise very sharply from the UK. The ability for students to travel, to come to post-secondary, putting aside a whole bunch of international students who are no longer coming to the country, domestic students' ability to travel and to live away from home changes. And there's a couple of things to bear in mind in this space. One is that there are plenty of students in Canada, but they are not, you're going to have to think about how to reach them differently, and they're going to have different needs as students. Some of the work I was involved in at Edinburgh in the scaling up of online and distance learning at Edinburgh was thinking about how we scaled up and changed all the support services that for students as well as the education delivery, recognizing that what we did for distance learners was as valuable for students who still came to campus, because we use this phrase, all students are part-time students. Virtually all students have to have a job to fund their studies. So even if they're enrolled full-time, they're probably studying part-time. And so some of opening up our institutions and embracing digital across our business can benefit everybody. But yes, the money problems aren't ours alone. There are domestic students, but they're not where we expect them to be, and they have different needs. But we also, I think, know what's going on in Canada in terms of a global economic picture. Education is still fundamental to a strong economy. We're talking about skills transition in this country. We're talking about big infrastructure projects. In some areas of the country, there is a bump coming through the the K-12 system right now that will hit the post-secondary system in the next few years. In BC, there's a bump of domestic students coming. But as I said, they're not necessarily going to be where we want them to be, where we've traditionally brought them to, and they're not going to have the same needs, and they're going to have some new constraints. And I mentioned that skills transition piece. As this was an RBC report, I think there's a couple of quite interesting reports produced by RBC recently around the education sector. And I recognize this enormously from my work at COL. As economic volatility becomes our new normal, lifelong learning needs to as well. As the world becomes more complex, people need to be able to grab whatever opportunity is available, and that means upskilling and reskilling. So really thinking about lifelong learners and thinking about credentials as stepping stones, and not thinking about micro-credentials as enrollment funnels into traditional degrees. I think some of us in the post-secondary sector that's been a comfortable place to be, and I think we're going to have to push out of that a little bit. So, it feels like the world is on fire. This is literally the world on fire. I was heading back to Vancouver from a visit to the UK in 2023, and this is what flying over a wildfire looks like from 35,000 feet. And it is a heck of a reminder that we can feel very small in this moment in the face of some very big challenges. And so I just want to re-emphasize that point that I made before, which is that there are solutions, there are things we can do. It means working differently than we have done before, but there are things we can do to meet some of the challenges that are in front of us. But we've got to look those challenges in the face. But we do have actually a very expansive and strong and proven toolkit. We just have to know how to use it. So you're getting the theme of where I'm going with this. Open education, that big picture of open education, is our innovation toolkit. And I think in Canada, the case for OER, particularly in provinces like BC and Ontario, with strong organisations like BC Campus and eCampus Ontario, the case for OER is pretty strongly made. And I'm going to suggest that in a system of mixed and diminishing resource, so big institutions, small institutions, rural colleges, vocational institutions, community colleges, collaboration and sharing models of things that work, as we do at COL across the Commonwealth, is the only way forward. When the money drops out of the system, and when you don't have very much money to begin with, you've got to make what you have go further. And part of that is about not duplicating. Part of that is about sharing what works. And again, organisations like eCampus Ontario, you're well placed to do some of this because you've got an organisation that can help do some of that connecting work in the same way as we do at COL. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about 3 areas where I think that we could use this open education innovation toolkit. One is around shared services to support blended and online learning. So if students aren't where they've traditionally been, then you're going to have to diversify to continue to find student enrollment. You're going to have to do some blended and online learning. But that comes with a cost. So I want to talk a little bit about shared services. I'll touch a little bit on shared courseware. There are some good models out there that work. And this is not OER, and I'll explain that in a moment. And then that lifelong learning piece and some of the more flexible learning pathways that we might need to think about as well. So I'll just say digital sovereignty is a word and a phrase. There are two words and a phrase that you've probably been hearing a lot as well. So some of our ability to buy ed tech in the way that we have in the past has probably changed. Again, I know in BC, buying from American suppliers of anything has been a little bit difficult. And there is a higher level of scrutiny around where citizen data is going at this moment in time. Canada is not alone in that conversation. That's a huge conversation that's playing out in Europe, and that is a conversation we have, again, across all 56 countries of the Commonwealth. But digital sovereignty gives us a moment to think about, okay, well, what if we were to meet some of our needs ourselves? If we have to do it, maybe for some security needs, financial data security, what might that look like? So in thinking about how we address this moment of digital sovereignty, I want to give some examples of some shared service models that we could consider. The first one, and for those that know me, they will know why this is the first one. This is a project that I've been involved in BC since 2018, the Open ATC. This is a collaborative group inside BC providing shared educational technologies and sort of OER learning design templates within that shared set of technologies. The biggest part of that stack is WordPress, a shared WordPress instance that's available for all post-secondaries across the province. And this is a really good example because it's open source software, but it's a shared support model sitting on top of it. So in this model, until this point in time, we're going through a transition at the moment, but until this point in time, the service has been maintained by people donating time, not just money. There is money needed, obviously, in this, but a lot of the support needs are met through a shared support model. And there's some other good examples of this kind of in-kind support model for running a shared service in BC as well in the library sector. So we share an open source platform, which reduces some running costs. We share the support by having a distributed support model, so people from across different institutions participate and provide the technical support. And then we share templates for sites, these sort of learning designs encapsulated as OER. So we share practice, teaching practice, learning artifacts across the province. So it enables all different kinds of sharing and capacity building. It's very cheap to run. We are having to think about how we move into a different funding model than the one we've had to date. But it doesn't change the costs of the service. It's just about where the funding for it comes from. But this, as I say, has been running since 2018. So what's that again? Quick maths. 2016. I've been involved since 2018. So nearly 9 years. This has been running viably. The next one is another small system in BC. This is a really good example of the kind of niche technologies that are hard to buy and where we might need to be our own suppliers to have the kind of diversity in the education system that we want. So EDHR is an electronic health record for training healthcare practitioners, primarily nurses, on electronic record keeping. If nurses take better patient records, patient outcomes are better. Better data management in healthcare equals better health outcomes. So it's very important in training healthcare professionals to train them in how to take patient data and how to manage patient data. This was developed as open source software. There's now a small company that provide a paid for SaaS service. And BCIT, who were one of the lead institutions in the development of the software, are developing an onboarding guide. So this is a really nice one where you've got, an open source software, so somebody could run their own instance if they want to. There's no vendor lock-in here. There's a small company who are providing commercial services to make it available as hosting as a service, because it's a bit too small maybe for some institutional IT departments to want to run. And in some institutions, the capacity just isn't there in the local IT department, some of the smaller colleges, for example. But the healthcare need is absolutely there. Healthcare practitioners, the need is there all across the world, quite bluntly. And then you've got a lead institution developing resources that can be used by any other institution as part of the onboarding. And there's some curriculum resources being developed in there as well. And then the final one this is one I was involved with years ago at the University of Edinburgh, which is still a running service. This is, again, another open source platform, Jupyter Computational Notebooks. And University of Edinburgh has a service unit, whose job it is to provide paid for services to the rest of the education sector. EDINA is the name of the unit. They've been doing this for years. They started off with some mapping tools based on Ordnance Survey maps. So this is a big, well-resourced institution being a service provider for small institutions that can't afford to do this for themselves. So if you were to buy Notable, which is the Jupyter Computational Notebook system, it looks like buying SaaS. It looks like buying software as a service, but the money is staying within the education sector. It's just one institution passing money to another institution. And more importantly, the development and the enhancement of this platform is by educators for educators. There's no profit motive in here. There's no shareholder dividends being paid out the back of this. So I say all of this because sometimes when we talk about shared services and we talk about particularly open source, which is one way sometimes to keep some of the costs down, I frequently hear we can't run open source, it's difficult. No, there are viable models for this. And they can involve commercial partners, they can involve large institutions, they can involve in-kind donations. There are business models for all of these. But it involves us coming together and stepping out of our institutional silos and thinking about, well, how do we run things for a sector? How do we run things for a cluster of institutions? But open is that openness to collaboration as well as open source software is what will allow us to do this. I'm keenly aware of time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. Semba is another call project, but this one has been running for 23 years now. This is shared curriculum for an MBA and a Master's in Public Administration, developed in 2002 initially. The curriculum continues to be updated. It's not OER. Institutions pay a small licensing fee for the curriculum. But it allows small institutions that don't have the capacity to develop an entire master's program themselves to collaborate on the development of a set of curriculum materials that can be used in any institution, developed by multiple institutions. So again, it's money staying within the same sector. It's money staying within education systems. And in this case, it translates across regions. These programs are offered in Asia, in Africa, in the Caribbean. It's the same curriculum in multiple places, and it's Commonwealth universities coming together to do the maintenance of that curriculum. So essentially, Collar, the middleman, we collect a small licensing fee for using these materials, and then we pay that money back out to support the development and the ongoing maintenance of those materials. So the money doesn't leave the education sector. It comes into call and it goes back out again into many of those same universities. And I highlight that because in some of the work I've done in BC over the last few years, as part of the CERT initiative. And Josie Gray, I think, was on this call earlier. She's the project manager for it. There are some case studies and one project actually working its way through the CERT initiative that are looking at similar shared curriculum models. Again, another healthcare one, because that's a space of acute need. So again, if we are trying to think about new learners, learners at a distance, students with different needs, and we need to think about how we develop curriculum for them and to meet those needs. Can we stop worrying about competing with each other, and can we start developing curriculum collaboratively and then sharing that out across ourselves when we think about the financial models that are needed to support that? Because our ability to move quickly to meet the demands and the needs of our students in a complex and challenging moment are only going to be enabled by doing more work together. I will gloss over a couple of these slides, but if you haven't had a look at this recent report from BC Campus, from David Porter, he's essentially digging into that shared curriculum and actually suggesting that in micro-credentials, we should go a little bit further than even between institutions and really think about developing content in partnership with industry, make sure it's really relevant. And he uses co-development. So, not just consultation, but where can we actually bring expertise in from industry and make sure that what we deliver is really relevant and on the money. TRU in BC have been doing some very interesting work looking at micro-credentials for transfer credit. Again, prior recognition of learning tends to be something you'll find in open universities more than other places, but this is about looking at how micro-credentials from any institution can be worth something in other institutions. So again, not micro-credentials as an enrollment funnel into your degree programs, but micro-credentials as those stepping stones on a pathway of a lifetime of learning, but thinking about how we can use provincial credit banks and transfer systems to enable that and make that visible. And in that same vein, I'll just highlight Munster Technological University in Ireland, who has been doing this kind of industry-focused, short learning work for 20-something years, and has made a prior recognition of learning model financially viable by really thinking about targeting big areas of industry in the region. And the technological universities in Ireland are a super interesting sector to look at in general. They're an evolving sector right now, all about upskilling, reskilling, regional economic development. So again, PLAR, which tends to be an open university superpower, can underpin some of these lifelong learning pathways in combination with industry outreach. And I know that's not going to be appropriate for every kind of post-secondary institution, but in a moment of economic instability, I think we also have to be realistic that those students who are prepared to invest in education are probably those who are hoping to get something out the other end of it, and that something is more often than not a job or a job that pays more. That was something I heard over and over and over again at Athabasca University. I can't not name check some work that we've been doing in Commonwealth of Learning, looking at micro-credentials frameworks. And if you are interested in seeing a kind of big picture view across many Commonwealth countries, there are 2 reports we just produced, which start to think about how we can use micro-credentials as this kind of open learning superpower in some of the countries in which we work. Thinking about common frameworks. And again, I know in Canada we have this fragmented landscape, but if we want to think about how students might work across different provinces, how they might transfer learning across different provinces, there might be some interesting reading in here. And then the final thing I'm going to highlight in that sharing vein is money. I've talked about money a couple of times already, about keeping money within the system. But I think as we think about how to use some of this open learning, open education toolkit that we have, and some of this collaboration superpower that we can choose to exercise if we want to or not, one of the things we can share is the business model. We don't tend to share this. This is the kind of stuff provosts and other people feel deeply uncomfortable about sharing. But if there's not very much money, then we have to be really careful that what we choose to invest in, the changes that we make, are going to deliver. And that involves financial planning. And I think the more we can do to reduce risk by sharing what works and sharing tools for developing planning business plans that are going to work, the better. And again, this is work we do in other Commonwealth countries, and we've been starting to pull all of that work together into a set of materials which we will be publishing in the next few months. So we've been looking at literature on business models, we've been looking at guiding principles, we've been looking at examples from across the field, mostly in developing countries, but there is always something to be learned. And we have a set of recommendations and a set of practical tools for doing the financial modelling of an open learning initiative. And as I say, we'll be publishing that in the next few months. So if I could leave you with one thought, it is to think about this moment and the constraints that we are facing in Canada and in many other places, not as paralyzing, not as paralyzing negative forces, but think about how this moment of pressure and this moment of discomfort can become a spark of innovation. How can we use this moment to radically change the way we work and to radically innovate? And my suggestion is that we've got a heck of a toolkit to do that with. And these principles of sharing and collaboration in combination with that toolkit can be the answer if we want them to be. So I will end. This is one of my favorite pieces of artwork back in Scotland, and end and say that there's hard work to be done in here. There will be no miracles. Nobody is coming to save us, I don't think, but I think we have what we need to save ourselves. And for as much as this is an uncomfortable moment, I have some optimism. I think there's a huge amount of capacity in the people and the skills and the knowledge we have inside Canada particularly. I'll shut up and see if there are any questions, and I will stop sharing so we can I can see the chat now, and there's quite a lot of it. Mary.
Hi. Thank you so much for that wonderful talk, Anne-Marie. Well, I'm going to invite everybody to use the chat or the Q&A to put any questions. I actually have one myself, so if you don't mind me cutting the line. My question is, you talked about the range of work that the Commonwealth of Learning work does, from huge system-wide to all the way to individual. I'd love to know, how do you maintain momentum when it comes to working on these sort of long-term system levels change during unstable times?
They're small projects. So we have an overarching model, if you like, but within that, so we have a big picture idea of what the change needs to be, but we break it down into small pieces of work. And I said that there's only 40 of us, but I used that phrase capacity building a lot as well. We hire consultants to deliver a lot of the work, and we hire consultants in country. So we're not about going to be bold here, but we're not about taking expensive consultants from rich countries and dropping them into small countries. We do a lot of south to south collaboration. We do a lot of using what's in that country or within that region, and doing that capacity building work. So although there's 40 of us, we can pull on a much larger group of people. We can pull on a larger group of people who have knowledge particular to that region, who can help navigate some of that complexity. And we just make the pieces of work small, doable, bite-sized chunks. We know they're going to build into something bigger, but if you just bite them off in small chunks, you get a win, you get the next one, you get the next one, and then over a period of time, you see how the win has built up into something more systemic. That Adrienne Marie Brown quote that I used, if anybody's aware of her book Emergent Strategy, she talks about these repeating patterns of small changes, social movements, all doing small things, but repeating patterns of small changes. She uses a fractal metaphor, which I think is very effective at the micro level. And at the macro level, the change can look the same, but the macro is made up of many, many small micro parts of the same. So I think that's a useful metaphor to have in mind. Lots of small moves, which ultimately build into something big. We can all find something small that we can do today.
That really emphasizes your point about how we have to save ourselves, right? This is how you get there in both proven ways as well as metaphors, workly and theoretically.
Well, and small amounts of money.
Yeah,
You know, nobody's going to sign off a big moonshot project right now. Well,
that's true.
maybe the federal government will.
I do have a couple questions in the Q&A. The first one is spicy, so get ready for it. Hi, Anne-Marie. Thank you for the great talk. My question is, how do you think the Jays will do against Yamamoto tomorrow night?
Oh my God, Terry. Okay, so I'm assuming this is a baseball question, and that will be this, hotshot Japanese, doesn't speak any English guy on the Dodgers team. I've been listening to the news. I wouldn't like to project that, Terry, but I will say, as somebody who is days away from submitting their citizenship application, I know which side of that competition I'm rooting for.
Perhaps we should have gotten you a Jays background. We have another question here. Fantastic discussion. Thank you. Can you speak more about expanding the reach of open education past the early adopters?
Thank you, Robert. That's a really a really interesting challenge. I think I think there are some systemic barriers in Canada at the moment, and those RBC reports make for quite interesting reading. I think I will contrast um, my experience in the UK and looking at Europe with Canada and the extent to which open education is understood in Canada. So I think the Open University of the UK, it's a national institution. It partners with the national broadcaster. It's been in my field of view my entire life. I don't think it's weird. It's just one of a number of institutions. And then I moved to Athabasca and saw a very different view of the world. Um, and some of it is about a little bit of that kind of um, competitive kind of partisanship, which I think sadly we find in too many education systems at the moment. But I think that the opportunity at this moment is to frame open education, as I hope I've done, as the solution to some of the problems, because people are actively looking for solutions to some really hard problems. And so I think if we can demonstrate with case studies and examples where open education can be the solution to a problem that somebody is feeling right now, that's our best chance. It's the what's in it for me angle. You're right, early adopters to date have maybe embraced it for altruistic reasons. Certainly in the OER space, reducing student textbook costs. But I think those are more pressing realities now.
We have two more questions right now. So I think one links right now to where we're at, which is great talk. Have to bring up the elephant in the room. On balance, is generative AI a threat or an opportunity when it comes to overcoming barriers to openness?
Oh, John, I know this man. That's um, so generative AI is a product, we think and a technology. ChatGPT is a product, an LLM is a technology. And some of the work I do is I'm on the board of the Open Source Initiative, who steward the global definition of open source software, and that's what underpins all open source software licenses. And we have been developing the same for generative AI, or for AI, for machine learning systems, an open source AI definition, because that's what's required to enable the licensing infrastructure for open source AI models, particularly generative AI models. And if you think about how fundamentally important Creative Commons licenses have been to the OER space, this is why I do this work, because licenses for open source AI are what will allow us to have an open source commons, an open commons of generative AI. Generative AI applications. Now, there are costs to developing LLMs, and particularly at the top scale. No university is ever going to be able to do that, though many research universities are networked into some of that huge research infrastructure. So I'll come back to the point I made with the Adina example, and notable big universities who can be service providers for small universities. So I don't see generative AI as big of a threat. I think Gen AI products, ChatGPT and others, are problematic, can be used for good, can be used for evil. We can find examples of both. But I would encourage us to think about those principles of agency and by education and for education, and how we might be able to get some agency over those technologies and develop them for our own purposes and our own uses. And some of that teacher in the loop work that we do at CALL is based on LLMs that we are training with OERs crowdsourced from within countries, for example. There's some other work that we're doing about offline AI in a box to take generative AI into offline, off-grid contexts as well, which is a kind of no learner left behind kind of model.
I think that actually ends up lining up really well with our final question we have in our Q&A, which goes, thank you for the great session. My question is slightly outside around the main topic, but it comes from a personal interest. Could you share some ideas or directions on how Indigenous pedagogies might connect with open education? Thanks so much.
Thank you. I'm going to say I am not well placed to answer that question. I think there's a fundamental point about Indigenous practitioners having voice and agency in this space. But I will say that they can be complementary or they can be diametrically opposed. I think of some of the licensing. So some of the thoughts we have about licensing, our whole conception of copyright is based on a very Western understanding of ownership of intellectual property. And that is not always shared by Indigenous communities, and not just within Canada, across the world. And so where we're talking about open education, and we're thinking about it grounded in those open sharing licenses, that's where I see some of the tensions. If we think about some of those principles around equity, around inclusion, around collaboration, we think about different ways of knowing and seeing the world and being open to different world viewpoints, different ways of learning. I think there's great complementarity. It's very complementary. I'm trying to say complicated words. But I think where we are maybe doubling down on open licensing, we get into problems. Generative AI is a really good example. I know we're at time, but I'm going to tell a little story because I think it's a good one. Go and have a look at Te Hiku Media in New Zealand. They have the largest corpus of spoken te reo Maori because they've been a media company for many years. They have suffered the same kinds of, the Maori community in New Zealand has suffered the same kinds of indignities as have been suffered here around, the language and cultural knowledge being pushed out of education systems, being pushed out of society. And then at the moment there was a buck to be made in training speech to text engines, every software company came knocking on their door and said, you've got the largest corpus in the world of spoken te reo Maori, can we have it? And they said, no, you cannot, because we're never releasing this as open data. It's not ours to release this as a cultural treasure. They defined a licensing model that treats it as a cultural treasure. But more than that, they've been using open source software and generative AI models to build Maori language learning applications. And what's important there is it's by the community for the community. They're not just making sure that the interpretation of the language is done by Te Reo speakers. The jobs are in the Te Reo community. The economic benefit of that work is in the Te Reo community as well, and in the Maori community. So I share that because I think that's a nice example of where open source software has become a toolkit that they can use. But open data is diametrically opposed to what it is they're trying to achieve. But those principles of agency and ownership are absolutely at the heart of it, that open has given them the ability to have agency and one hopes some level of economic empowerment as well. And there's some great keynotes. There was a Creative Commons keynote by the CEO of Te Hiku Media a few years ago. So I'm going to look for that.
Amazing.
Oh, and somebody's asking about Coraline earrings. No, I don't. I have earrings made by a British artist, but yes, these are my Halloween earrings. I wore them in honor Samhain, as we would call it in Scotland.
Thank you. Amazing. We've gone a little bit over time, but I think it was
I'm
well worth
sorry.
the opportunity to hear that story. I feel like we landed on a really good place. So to wrap up the session, I wanted to just say thank you so much, Anne-Marie, for your time today, for sharing the frameworks, the resources, and the stories to get us thinking and inspired. I also want to take a moment to invite everybody who's here now to join us at the same link for our next session at 2 p.m. Reflections from Brock University on our institution's ethical framework for educational technologies, but possibly a very cohesive element from where we landed today's session. And of course, to join us at the Key on November 11th to 12th for our in-person 2 days sessions on education insights, workshops, and coming together in person to reinvent education for a resilient future. Take care, everyone, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank
you,
you,
Anne-Marie.
everybody.